The key in my hand felt like an ice chip, its cold, sharp teeth biting into the soft flesh of my palm. I stood on the porch of the only home I'd ever known, the one my Arthur built for me with his own 2 hands, and I tried to breathe. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and the heavy perfume of the lilac bushes Arthur had planted for our 25th anniversary. He'd said their purple blooms matched the color of my eyes. Now my old eyes, blurred with unshed tears, could only see them as smudges of gray in the twilight. Inside that house, pressed between the pages of my old Bible, was a sonogram photo, the edges soft and yellowed with time. My son, Evan, was just a tiny ghostly peanut in that image, a secret joy growing in the dark. I remembered the feel of Arthur's hand on my swollen belly, his voice a low rumble against my skin. "We're going to give him everything, Clara, everything we never had." He'd meant a stable home, an education, unconditional love. We'd poured that everything into the foundation of this very house, into the scraped knees mended on this porch, into the countless bedtime stories read in the room that would forever be his. Now, that everything was a hollow echo, and the boy I had sung to sleep was upstairs, in his old room, probably laughing with the woman who was going to become his wife tomorrow. Isabella? The name tasted like ash in my mouth. She was beautiful, there was no denying it. She had the kind of polished magazine cover beauty that seemed out of place among my simple hand-stitched quilts and well-worn furniture. Her hair was always perfectly smooth, her clothes crisp and expensive, her smile a calculated flash of white. She'd swept into Evan's life like a glamorous hurricane, and he, my gentle, earnest boy, had been utterly captivated. I'd tried. God knows, I'd tried to love her for his sake. I'd bitten my tongue when she'd redecorated his apartment, tossing out the ugly ceramic mug he'd made for me in 3rd grade that he'd kept for his pencils. I'd smiled through dinners where she'd monologued about minimalist aesthetics and the importance of curating one's life, her eyes subtly critiquing my cluttered, love-filled home. I saw the way she looked at me, not with malice, but with a kind of dismissive pity, as if I were a quaint, slightly embarrassing relic from a time she was eager to forget. The rehearsal dinner had been a quiet affair at a new trendy restaurant in town. I'd worn my best dress, a simple navy blue shift I'd owned for a decade, but I'd felt like a ghost at the feast. Isabella's family was there, all sharp suits and designer handbags, talking loudly about investments and vacations in places I couldn't pronounce. Evan had been stuck to their side, a nervous, eager smile on his face. He'd glanced at me a few times, a flicker of my boy in his eyes, but he'd been pulled back into their orbit each time. I was a satellite, drifting further and further away. I'd left early, pleading a headache, which wasn't entirely a lie. The throb behind my eyes was a steady drumbeat of sorrow. The house had never felt so large, so empty. Arthur's absence was a physical weight in every room. I'd just settled into his old armchair, a worn afghan pulled over my legs, when I heard the soft click of the front door. "Clara? You still up?" It was Isabella's voice, honey-sweet and false. I straightened up, smoothing my dress. "In here, dear." She glided into the living room, a vision in a cream-colored cashmere coat. She didn't sit. She stood in the center of the rug my mother had woven, looking around the room as if she were already assessing its square footage. "The dinner was lovely, wasn't it?" she said, though her tone suggested it had been merely adequate. "It was very nice," I replied, my voice thin. "Evan Set's having a last drink with my father. You know, talking business." She waved a dismissive hand. "I just wanted to come by and, well, clarify a few things about tomorrow, and beyond." My heart started a slow, heavy pound. Clarify? Yes. She finally looked at me, and her smile was gone. In the soft lamplight, her face was all sharp angles and cold calculation. "Tomorrow Evan and I begin our real life. A fresh start. We have certain aspirations, a certain social circle. It's important that we present a unified modern front." I nodded slowly, not understanding, but the ice in my veins was beginning to spread. "That life," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more terrifying than outright anger, "doesn't really have a place for Well, for this, she gestured vaguely at the room, at me, the constant little visits, the well-meant but outdated advice, the casseroles, the stories about the past. It's all so heavy, it holds him back. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at her, at the cruel perfection of her features. Evan would never say it, she said, and her voice took on a note of faux sympathy that was worse than contempt. He loves you, in his way, but he's too soft-hearted. He doesn't see how you cling to him, how you burden him with your loneliness. He needs to be free to become the man he's meant to be, with me. She took a step closer, and I could smell her perfume, something expensive and icy. So I think it's best for everyone, truly for everyone, if you make yourself scarce after the wedding, a clean break. Maybe you could move to one of those lovely senior communities in Florida. I hear they have excellent bingo. The corner of her mouth twitched. The best wedding gift you could possibly give us, Clara. The absolute best gift would be if you just vanished from our lives. Vanished. The word hung in the air between us, sucking all the oxygen from the room. It was a final, absolute erasure, not just of me, but of Arthur, of our history, of every sacrifice, every scraped knee, every lullaby. She wasn't just asking for distance, she was demanding my complete and total annihilation from the narrative of her perfect life. I looked down at my hands, at the wedding band I still wore next to my own, at the veins like rivers on a map of a long life lived. I thought of Arthur Sip's last words to me, his breath a faint rustle in the sterile hospital room. Take care of our boy Clara, you Sip are his foundation. And in that moment, a quiet, terrifying clarity settled over me, a calm so profound it felt like a different kind of death. I wasn't his foundation anymore. I was an obstacle, and if that was the case, then everything I had built, everything I had saved and protected for him, was based on a lie. I lifted my head and looked at her. I didn't sit cry. I didn't sit yell. I simply nodded, my movements slow and deliberate. I see, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Thank you for your honesty, Isabella. She looked momentarily startled, as if she expected tears, pleading, a scene. My placid acceptance was unnerving, but she recovered quickly, her smirk returning. Good. I knew you would be sensible. Well, big day tomorrow. Get some rest. She turned and left, her heels tapping a triumphant rhythm on my hardwood floor. The front door closed with a soft, final click. I sat there for a long time, in the profound silence she had left behind. I didn't move, I just listened to the sound of my own heart breaking, not into sharp, painful shards, but grinding into a fine, cold dust. Vanished. The word became a mantra, a command, and I decided then and there that I would obey, but I would do it my way. The first call I made wasn't to a realtor, it was to my lawyer, David Meyer, Arthur Sip's oldest friend. His voice was groggy with sleep when he answered. Clara? Everything all right? No, David, I said, my voice eerily calm. It sets not. I need you to listen very carefully, and I need you to do exactly as I ask, without question. I laid out the plan in a flat, unemotional monotone. The house, the deed, the trust Arthur had set up, the fact that while I had always promised this house to Evan, my name was the only one on the deed. It was my asset, wholly and completely. I told him I wanted it listed immediately, for a price that would guarantee a quick sale. I wanted everything moved into storage, my storage, not Evan's. I wanted the paperwork drawn up to dissolve the small trust fund Arthur had left for Evan's future children, redirecting it to the local animal shelter. I wanted it all done by morning. David was silent for a long moment. Clara, my God, what sips happened? Is this about the wedding? Did you and Evan have a fight? The wedding is cancelled, David. I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. You will be receiving a list of guests to contact in the morning. Tell them, the family is dealing with a severe and private emergency. Tell them the truth. That it's cancelled. Clara, you can be serious. This is nuclear. Evan is your son. Evan is a man who is allowing his future to be curated, I said. Isabella Sepp's word tasting foul on my tongue. And I am an outdated piece that doesn't sept fit the collection. So I sept am removing myself, and I sept am taking my gallery with me. The next few hours were a blur of quiet, furious activity. While the world slept, I moved through my house like a ghost. I took the important things, the photo albums, Arthur's letters from basic training, my grandmother's silver, the small, precious things that held the soul of our family. I packed a single suitcase with my clothes. I did not go into Evan's room. I did not look at the wedding suit hanging in the hall closet. I wrote 2 letters. The first was to the new owners of the house, a young couple I'd seen looking at it with stars in their eyes weeks ago. I told them about the lilacs, about how much sun the kitchen got in the morning, about the loose floorboard by the fireplace that Arthur had never quite gotten around to fixing. I wished them a lifetime of happiness within its walls. The second letter was for Evan. It was short. I didn't call him my son. I didn't sign it, Mom. Evan, you once told me that the greatest gift I ever gave you was a sense of home. Last night, Isabella informed me that the greatest gift I could give you now is my absence. I have decided to be generous. The house and everything in it belong to me. It was a gift I intended to give you, but gifts, I've learned, must be given to those who understand their value. You have chosen a different foundation for your life. I hope it makes you happy. Do not try to find me, Clara. As the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, I placed the letter on the kitchen table, right on the spot where Evan had once left me a Mother's Day card decorated with clumsy, childish hearts. I took one last look around. I breathed in the smell of home, of lemon polish, old books and love. Then I walked out the door, got into my old sedan, and drove away. I didn't look back. The months that followed were a strange, quiet journey. I used the money from the house's quick, cash sale. The young couple got their dream, to buy a small, cozy cottage in a seaside town in Maine, a place Arthur and I had talked about retiring to. I painted the walls the colors I wanted. I got a cat from the local shelter. I joined a book club. My life was small and quiet, and it was mine. The pain was a constant low hum, like the sound of the ocean at night, but it was no longer a sharp, tearing thing. It was just a part of the landscape of my new life. I never heard from Evan. Not a call, not a letter. David Meyer kept me updated, his voice always laced with a sadness for me. He told me Evan and Isabella had been blindsided. They'd arrived at the house the morning of the wedding, no doubt to collect me, only to find a sold sign staked into the front lawn and a realtor handing the keys to the new owners. The wedding, of course, had collapsed into chaos and humiliation. Isabella's family was furious. Evan, David said, had been first incredulous, then angry, then utterly broken. He asked me why, Clara, David said during one call. He said he had no idea what happened. He knew, I said. My voice soft but firm. He may not have heard the words, David, but he knew. He chose not to see. I thought that was the end of it. I had vanished, just as requested. The gift had been given. I was wrong. On a crisp autumn afternoon, with a fire crackling in my hearth and a book in my lap, I heard a car door slam outside. My heart, foolish thing, gave a little leap. It was probably a neighbor. It was always a neighbor. But the footsteps on my porch were too heavy, too hesitant. A knock came at the door, soft, unsure. The cat jumped off my lap. I set my book down, my hands suddenly trembling. I knew, even before I walked to the door, even before I saw his silhouette through the frosted glass, I knew. I opened the door. And there he was, Evan, my boy, but he was a ghost of the man I'd last seen. His face was pale and drawn, etched with lines of a fatigue that went deeper than sleep. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess. He'd lost weight, but it was his eyes that undid me. They were the same warm brown they'd always been, but now they were shattered, filled with a confusion and a pain so deep it seemed to swallow all the light around them. He didn't speak. He just stood there on my porch, his shoulders slumped, the autumn wind tugging at his jacket. He looked at me, then past me, into my warm, small, safe cottage, a home that had no memories of him. In his hand, he clutched a piece of paper, crumpled and worn soft at the edges. I recognized my own handwriting. His lips moved, but the sound that came out was a broken whisper, a ragged thing torn from the deepest part of him. "Mom?" he breathed. The word a question? A plea? A confession? "She's gone. Isabella, she left. She said there was no point anymore. She said," his voice cracked, and a single devastating tear traced a path down his cheek. "She said we had nothing. She said you took it all." He looked down at the letter in his hand, then back up at me, his expression one of utter, complete devastation. It was the look of a man who had lost his compass, his map, and every landmark he had ever known. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking completely, "what did you do? And why? Why did you leave me?" And he stood there, waiting for an answer, a lost boy on the porch of the only mother he had left, with the vast cold emptiness of the life he'd chosen stretching out behind him. The silence between us was heavier than any I had ever known, filled with the wreckage of a house, a wedding, and a heart. He stood there, a monument to his own ruin, and the wind off the ocean seemed to blow right through him. I saw the boy and the man so clearly then, the little boy who'd skinned his knee on the driveway and run to me howling, sure that my kiss could mend anything. That boy was trapped inside this shattered man, begging to be let out. For a long moment, we just existed in that space. The gulf of the porch step between us, the past year a chasm at our feet, the scent of wood smoke from my fireplace curled out into the cold air, a warmth he was not yet invited to share. "What did I do?" I finally said, my voice low, not with anger, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness. "I gave the bride exactly what she asked for, Evan. It was her #1 item on the registry, my complete and total disappearance." He flinched as if I'd struck him. She said that. She told me you'd had a fight, that you were being dramatic, that you'd stormed off in a huff and sold the house to punish me for choosing her." The words tumbled out, a rehearsed script he'd clearly been repeating to himself for months. It was his armor, and it was crumbling before my eyes. "Come inside, Evan," I said, stepping back from the door. "It sets cold." He hesitated, his eyes darting past me again, taking in the small living room, the shelves of my books, the photograph of his father on the mantel. It was a new home, but it was built with the old bones of my life. His presence here felt like a seismic intrusion. He shuffled in, his movements clumsy, and stood awkwardly in the center of the rug. He was too big for this small space, a storm cloud contained in a teacup. I closed the door, shutting out the wind and the world, and the silence in the room became a living thing. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, moving toward the kitchen. It was a reflex, a mother's ingrained habit to offer comfort, to feed. I stopped myself, my hand on the back of a chair. That wasn't our dynamic anymore. I was no longer his comfort. I was his judge and his jury, and I had already passed sentence. "No," he whispered. "No, I don't understand." He held up the crumpled letter. "You sold our home. You canceled my wedding. You left me with nothing. You didn't even say goodbye. You just vanished." The word was a sob caught in his throat. "How could you do that? I'm your son." "Are you?" The question left my lips, quiet and devastating. I saw the shock hit him. A physical blow. The son I raised would have known. He would have felt it in his soul if something was that wrong with his mother. The son I raised would never have allowed a woman to speak to me the way she did and then dismissed it as dramatic. The son I raised would have fought for me. "You didn't fight, Evan. You just let me go." Tears were streaming down his face. Now, silent and unchecked, he made no move to wipe them away. "I didn't set no. She told me you were jealous, that you were trying to control us, to keep me tied to you. She said it was unhealthy. She said we needed to set boundaries." "Boundaries are one thing, Evan. Erasure is another." I walked to the mantel and picked up the photograph of Arthur. I held it out to him. Your father worked 3 jobs to put the down payment on that land. He dug the foundation with your grandfather. He hammered every nail, laid every floorboard. He did it for us. For our future. For your future. That house wasn't just a building, it was his heart, made of wood and stone, and she called it heavy. She called our history, your father's sweat, my love, a burden. I could see the memories flickering in his eyes, the ghost of his father's laugh echoing in the quiet room. He was remembering the Christmases, the birthday parties, the sound of rain on the porch roof. He was remembering the home he'd lost, and he was finally beginning to understand its value. The night before the wedding, I continued, my voice gaining a steely calm I didn't feel. She came here. She stood right where you're standing. She didn't raise her voice. She was cold and calm and absolutely certain of her right to carve me out of your life. She said the best gift I could give you was to vanish. So I did, but that house was mine. Evan, not yours, not yet. It was the last piece of you and your father I had left, and if my presence in your life was so disposable, then so was my gift. He sank into the armchair by the fire, his body folding in on itself as if all the strings holding him up had been cut. He dropped his face into his hands, and his shoulders shook with silent, ragged sobs. The sound was awful, a raw, grieving thing that filled my small cottage. I stood there watching my child break apart, and every instinct in my body screamed to go to him, to hold him, to rock him and tell him it would be all right. But I didn't move. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too fresh. My compassion had limits, and he had found every single one of them. She's gone, he mumbled into his hands, his voice thick and muffled. When the house was gone, when the money from the trust was gone, her parents, they were so angry. The humiliation, the wedding was a joke. Everyone knew. The prenup she wanted me to sign was void, because the assets it was protecting didn't exist anymore. She stayed for a few months, but she was different, cold. She said I was a failure, that I came with nothing but baggage. She left last week, took her things and left a note on the kitchen counter of the apartment. It's over. He finally looked up, his face ravaged. She never loved me, did she? It was the question of a child, a simple, heartbreaking question that held the sum total of his pain. I can't answer that, Evan, I said softly. I only know she loved the idea of you, the you that came with a beautiful debt-free home, the you that came with a future trust fund for her children, the you that was unencumbered by a messy, emotional, loving mother. She wanted to curate you, like one of her precious decor items, and when I took away the props, the show couldn't go on. The truth of it settled over him, a heavy, ugly blanket. He had been a set piece in her life's design, and when the set burned down, the play was over. I'm so sorry, Mom, he choked out. The words were barely audible, but they hung in the air between us, fragile and precious. I'm so sorry. I was blind. I was so in love with the idea of her, with that life. I didn't see what I was losing. I didn't see what I was letting her do to you, to us. He looked around my cottage, really seeing it for the first time. He saw his father's photo on the mantel. He saw the ugly ceramic mug from 3rd grade, now holding my pens on the desk. He saw the Afghan his grandmother had knitted draped over the back of the sofa. He saw that I had built a new life, a whole life, without him in it. The realization was a fresh wave of pain on his face. You've moved on, he whispered. A statement of awe and despair. I survived. I corrected him. There sits the difference. Do you hate me? The question was a mere breath. I took a long, slow breath of my own, looking into the fire. Did I hate him? I had. In those first, searing weeks of exile, a corrosive hatred had burned in my chest, hotter than any grief. I had hated his blindness, his weakness, his betrayal. But hatred is a heavy load for an old woman to carry across a new life. I had let it go, piece by piece, leaving it along the roadside like stones too heavy for my pockets. I could never hate you, I said, and it was the truth. You are my son. You are a piece of my heart, walking around outside my body. That doesn't set mean you didn't set break it. That doesn't set mean I can forget what you did. He nodded. A quick, jerky motion, absorbing the conditional nature of my love. It was no longer the unconditional, limitless love of his childhood. It was a love that had been tested and bore the scars. What do I do? He asked. His voice small. I have nothing. The apartment lease is in her name. My job. I said been so distracted. I think they said we're going to let me go. I have nowhere to go. He was asking me to fix it. After everything, the lost boy was still looking to his mother for salvation. The old Clara would have opened her arms, her home, her checkbook. She would have gathered up the pieces and tried to glue them back together. But the old Clara had vanished. I walked to the small desk in the corner and opened a drawer. I pulled out a checkbook. I wrote slowly, deliberately, the scratch of the pen the only sound in the room. I tore out the check and walked back to him. I didn't hand it to him. I placed it on the arm of his chair. This is $10,000, I said. It sits from the sale of the house. It sits the last money you will ever get from me. He stared at the check as if it were a venomous snake. It is not for you to come running back to me, I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for argument. It is not a down payment on my forgiveness. It is seed money, for you to start over, to find a room to rent, to buy groceries while you look for a new job, to get yourself into therapy, because you clearly need to understand why you were so willing to abandon the people who loved you for someone who only loved what you could provide. He looked from the check to my face, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. This wasn't the rescue he'd wanted. This was a lifeline thrown from a great distance, with the expectation that he would have to swim for it himself. This is your chance, Evan, I said, my tone softening just a fraction. Your chance to become the man your father believed you could be, not the man she wanted you to be, not the boy I spoiled. Your own man, a man of character, a man who knows the value of things that can set be sold. I turned and walked back to the fireplace, giving him my back, giving him space to absorb the enormity of what was happening. I heard the rustle of the check as he picked it up. How do I do that? He asked, his voice trembling. How do I even start? I looked at the photograph of Arthur. His smiling, hopeful face seemed to be looking right at me, trusting me to do the right thing for our boy. You start, I said, without turning around, by walking out that door. You start by being alone with yourself and all the choices you've made. You start by building something yourself, with your own two hands, and understanding what it costs. You start by proving to yourself and to me that you are more than the sum of your mistakes. The silence stretched out, long and thin. I heard him stand up, the floorboards creaking under his weight. I heard his shaky breath. Will I? He began, then stopped. Can I ever see you again? I finally turned to face him. The tears were gone from his face, replaced by a stark, raw vulnerability. He looked younger and older all at once. That, I said, my own heart cracking open just a little, will depend entirely on the man who comes back to see me, not today, not tomorrow, but someday. If that man has something to say to me, my door might be open. He nodded. A slow, accepting nod. He folded the check carefully and put it in his pocket. He looked at me for a long moment, memorizing my face, this new home, this new reality. Then he turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, his head bowed. I loved you, Mom, he whispered. I just forgot how to show it. And then he was gone. The door closed softly behind him, not with a slam, but with a quiet, final click. I listened to the sound of his car starting, the crunch of gravel as he pulled away, the engine noise fading until it was swallowed by the constant shushing sound of the ocean. I stood alone in the quiet of my cottage, the fire crackling, the cat weaving itself between my legs. The ghost of his visit lingered in the air, a scent of cold air and despair. I had given him the hardest gift a mother can give, not a safety net but the hard, cold ground, the chance to learn how to get back up on his own. I walked to the window, and looked out at the gray, endless sea. Somewhere out there, my son was driving into an uncertain future, armed with nothing but a check and a devastating lesson. The old Clara, the one who lived in the house Arthur built, would have been sick with worry. But I was not that woman anymore. I was someone harder, someone sadder, someone who had, against her will, learned how to vanish. And as I watched the sun begin to set, painting the water in shades of gold and violet, I let myself feel it all: the grief, the love, the hope, and the terrifying fragile possibility that from the ashes of everything we had lost, a better man, and perhaps a wiser mother, might finally be born. The waves continued to crash against the shore, relentless and eternal, washing away the old and bringing in the new, one painful, beautiful grain of sand at a time. The silence after he left was a physical presence. It was different from the silence of my solitude, which was filled with the murmur of the ocean, the purr of the cat, the crackle of the fire, and the gentle hum of my own thoughts. This new silence was charged, electric with the echoes of his pain, and the seismic shift his presence had caused. The air still vibrated with his unanswered question: "Can I ever see you again?" I didn't move from the window for a long time. I watched the light change over the water, the gold deepening to rose, then to a bruised purple. The check I'd written felt like it was burning a hole in the reality of the room: $10,000. It was a significant sum, but it was a pittance compared to the value of the home I'd sold, the future I'd dismantled. It was a calculated amount, enough to keep him from desperation, not enough to foster complacency. It was the first truly difficult boundary I had ever drawn with my son, and the weight of it threatened to buckle my knees. I thought of Arthur. What would he have done? He was always the softer touch, the one who would sneak Evan an extra cookie, who would read just one more story. He believed in second chances, in the fundamental goodness of our boy. But Arthur had never met Isabella. He had never been looked at with such dismissive contempt. He had never been asked to vanish. A part of me, the part that still shared a soul with him, knew he would have been just as wrecked as I was. But I also knew his anger would have been a righteous, protective inferno. He wouldn't have just sold the house. He might have burned it to the ground before letting her have it. A small, sad smile touched my lips. "I was merciful, Arthur," I whispered to his photograph. "I think." The cat, a fluffy gray thing I'd named Smudge, rubbed against my leg and meowed, a sharp reminder of the present. The practicalities of life continued. It was time for his dinner. The mundane act of scooping kibble into a ceramic bowl was a grounding ritual. It was simple. The cat was hungry. I fed him. He was happy. There was no subtext, no heartbreak, no devastating choices, just need and fulfillment. I couldn't eat. My stomach was a tangled knot of nerves and sorrow. I made a cup of tea, holding the warm mug between my hands, but I didn't drink it. I just stared into the steam, watching it curl and vanish, much like I had. The letter he'd brought was still on the arm of the chair. I picked it up. The paper was soft, the creases deep and permanent from being folded and unfolded, carried in a pocket, clutched in a desperate hand. My own words, written in a white-hot rage of hurt, stared back at me: "Do not try to find me." And he had. He had defied that final, cold command. He had searched for me. The realization sent a confusing jolt through me, part fear, part a treacherous, tiny flicker of hope. He had looked broken. Truly, fundamentally broken. This wasn't the performative sadness of a man who had lost a prized possession. This was the hollowed-out despair of someone who had lost his compass. Isabella's departure was just the final brick in a wall of his own making. He hadn't just lost a wife, he'd lost his mother, his home, his history, and the image he had of himself as a good man. He was adrift, and I had thrown him a line, but I had not pulled him ashore. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. Every ring of the phone, every car that drove too slowly past the cottage, every knock at the door, my heart would stutter into a frantic rhythm. It was never him. The silence from him was absolute. I had told him not to contact me, and for now he was obeying. I didn't know if that was a good sign or a bad one. David Meyer called. His voice was cautious. Clara! He came to see me. I gripped the receiver tighter, and he looked rough. He cashed the check. He asked me not to tell you he sept been there, but I thought you should know. He asked for the name of a therapist. I gave him a few recommendations. I closed my eyes. A wave of relief so potent it made me dizzy washing over me. He'd listened. He was taking the first step. Thank you, David. Clara, are you sure about this? This tough love approach? It's a brutal world out there for a young man on his own. The world has always been brutal. David, I said, my voice soft but resolute. I was just always there to stand between it and him. I was his cushion, and cushions are comfortable, but they don't teach you how to stand on hard ground. Isabella didn't break him. She just revealed how fragile he was because I'd never let anything pressure him. That was my failure. This is my attempt to correct it. David was quiet for a moment. I hope you sit right. I just hope it doesn't break him completely. So do I, David, I whispered. So do I. Winter settled over the coast with a profound, quiet intensity. The tourists vanished, and the small town retreated into itself. The ocean turned a leaden gray, and the wind carried a biting chill. My world shrank to the confines of my cottage, the library, and the grocery store. I learned the rhythms of my new life, the simple pleasures of a good book on a stormy afternoon, the company of Smudge, the weekly calls with a few old friends who knew only that I'd moved, not why. I thought of Evan constantly. I wondered if he was warm. I wondered if he had found a job. I wondered if he was eating. The mother in me, the one that had soothed nightmares and packed a million school lunches, was a constant aching pulse of worry. I had to consciously quiet her, to remind her that this was the only way. Love wasn't just softness. Sometimes love was the courage to be the hard thing. I started painting again. It was something I hadn't done since before Evan was born. Arthur had built me a small studio in the attic of our old house, a sunlit space that had slowly been taken over by storage. Here, I set up a small easel by the window that looked out to sea. I didn't paint pretty pictures. I painted turbulent gray-green waves. I painted empty chairs. I painted the stark skeletal branches of winter trees against a twilight sky. It was my grief, my anxiety, my hope, given form and color and brushstroke. It helped. It was a way to scream without making a sound. Months turned. The ice thawed, and the first brave crocuses pushed through the hard earth in my garden. The sharp edges of my own pain had begun to soften, worn down by time, and the gentle persistence of a life moving forward. The worry for Evan was now a constant, low-grade hum in the background of my days, a song I had learned to live with. And then, on a cool, bright morning in early spring, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't his hesitant, desperate knock from months before. This was firmer, more certain. My heart leaped into my throat. Smudge looked up from his sunspot, annoyed at the interruption. I set down my paintbrush, wiping my hands on a rag, and walked to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I opened it. He stood there, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him. It was Evan, but it wasn't the shattered man from the autumn. He stood straighter. His shoulders, which had been perpetually slumped in defeat, were now squared. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost. His hair was shorter, neat. He was dressed in clean, dark jeans and a simple sweater under a jacket. It wasn't the expensive, trendy clothing Isabella would have chosen. It was practical, honest clothing. But it was his eyes that held me. They were clear. The shattered, lost look was gone. In its place was a quiet gravity, a depth that hadn't been there before. He looked tired, but it was the honest tiredness of hard work, not of despair. In his hands, he held a simple clay flower pot. In it was a lilac sapling, its leaves a vibrant, hopeful green. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice was calm, steady. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the sapling, at the symbol of everything we had lost, everything he had remembered. "It's not much," he said. his voice a little rough, with emotion. It'll be years before it blooms, and it's not from the original bushes. I didn't have the right to ask the new owners for a cutting, but I found a nursery that had the same variety, Clara's Purple, they called it. A sob caught in my chest. Arthur Sepp's name for them. He took a slow, deep breath. I got a job. It's not a fancy job. I'm working construction with a crew. It's hard. My hands, he held one out, and I saw the fresh calluses, the nicks and scars. They hurt every night, but I'm learning. I'm learning how to build things, how to make something straight and strong and real. He looked past me, into the cottage, then back at my face, his gaze direct and unwavering. I've been seeing the therapist every week. We've been digging. It's ugly. I've had to face some things about myself that I don't like. Why I was so eager to be chosen by someone like her. Why I needed her version of a perfect life to feel valid. Why I was so willing to trade the love that was real for a fantasy that was shiny. He swallowed hard, his composure beginning to crack slightly around the edges. I was a coward, Mom. And I was selfish. And I am so sorry. I don't expect you to just wipe that away. I know it doesn't work like that. He held out the lilac sapling, a peace offering, a promise. I'm not asking to come back. I'm not asking for anything. I'm here. I'm trying to become a man you might be able to respect, a man Dad would have been proud of. I know I have a long way to go, but I wanted you to see that I started. I looked at my son. I saw the ghost of the little boy in his earnest eyes, but I also saw the man he was fighting to become. The journey had cost him everything. It had cost me everything. The road ahead was still long and uncertain. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend easily. It mends slowly with fragility, like a bone that will always bear the mark of the break. The door was still between us, a metaphor made real. But slowly, my hand trembling, I reached out and took the pot from him. The earth was cool and damp against my fingers. The leaves were soft. It was a living thing. It needed care. It needed time. It needed a place to put down roots. I looked from the sapling to my son's face, which was filled with a hope so fragile it broke my heart all over again. And then, with a silence that held more meaning than any words could, I stepped back from the doorway. It wasn't an invitation to come back into my life. Not yet. It was an invitation to come in from the cold. For a moment. For a cup of tea. For the first, fragile, terrifying step on a new road, one we would have to build together, one painful, honest brick at a time. The sun was warm on my back. The ocean, forever constant, whispered in the distance. He hesitated for only a second, then crossed the threshold. The air in the cottage shifted as he stepped inside. It was no longer just my space. It was now a shared territory, fraught with a history of love and loss. He stood just inside the doorway, hesitant, as if unsure where to put himself, how to exist in this new fragile dynamic. "It's nice in here," he said, his voice low, taking in the room with a new kind of attention. He was seeing the paintings propped against the wall, the turbulent seas, the empty chairs. His eyes lingered on them, and a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He didn't comment, but I saw him absorb the pain they represented. "Thank you," I said, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "Would you like some tea?" It was the same question Sept asked months ago when he was a broken thing on my porch. This time, he nodded. "Yes, please." I moved to the small kitchen nook. My movements automatic. Fill the kettle. Set it on the stove. The click of the gas igniting was a shockingly loud sound in the quiet room. I could feel him watching me, feel the weight of his gaze. I took down 2 mugs, plain, white ceramic, not the chunky, handmade one I used for myself. This felt like a negotiation, and I needed the neutrality of plain china. How have you been?" he asked. It was the kind of question you ask an acquaintance, and the awkwardness of it hung between us, highlighting the canyon that had opened up. I turned, leaning against the counter, crossing my arms. I sep been surviving, Evan. Like I said, I paint. I read. I listen to the ocean. It seps a quiet life. You always loved quiet, he said, almost to himself. I remember Dad used to tease you, say you could hear a pin drop in a hurricane. A ghost of a smile touched my lips. He did say that. The memory was a warm one, and for a moment it bridged the gap. The kettle whistled, a sharp, domestic sound that broke the spell. I poured the boiling water over the tea bags, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. I carried the mugs to the small table by the window and gestured for him to sit. He did. Folding his large frame into the chair, he wrapped his hands around the mug, not drinking, just absorbing its warmth. He looked at his hands, at the new calluses and scars. The work is hard, he said again, as if needing to prove it. But it's honest. My foreman Joe? He's about your age. He doesn't take any crap, but he's fair. He teaches you, if you listen, and if you're not afraid to get your hands dirty. He said this with a note of pride I hadn't heard in his voice in years. It wasn't the pride of a promotion or a bonus, it was the pride of competence, of earning a thing through sheer effort. I set him glad, I said, and I meant it. It sounds like a good man to learn from. He is. He sipped his tea, finally. I sipped him renting a room. It sips small, just enough space for a bed and a desk, but it sips clean, and it sips mine. I pay for it with my own money. Each statement was a brick he was laying down, building a new foundation in front of my eyes. I work, I earn, I pay, mine. They were simple words, but they were everything. We sat in silence for a few minutes, drinking our tea, watching the gulls wheel and cry over the water. The tension was still there, a live wire, but it was no longer screaming. It was humming, a low, bearable current. The therapist, he began, then stopped, choosing his words carefully. She says, I have a lot of guilt and shame, not just about you, about Dad too. I stayed quiet, letting him talk. She made me see that I've been running from his shadow my whole life, not because he was a bad father, because he was such a good one. He built everything. He provided everything. He was this giant, and I felt like I could never measure up. Isabella, she offered me a shortcut, a way to have the life he had, but without the hard work, a prefabricated version of success. I think I knew, on some level, it was a lie, but I wanted it so badly. I wanted to feel like I'd arrived, like I was finally the man he was. Tears welled in his eyes again, but these were different. They weren't except the tears of self-pity. They were the tears of painful, hard-won clarity. I was so stupid. I traded the real thing for a cheap imitation. Your father, I said slowly, wasn't born a giant, Evan. He became one. He grew up with nothing. He told me once he spent a winter sleeping in a borrowed coat, because he didn't have one of his own. He built himself, brick by brick, callus by callus. He didn't provide you with everything, so you wouldn't have to work. He provided you with everything, so you would have a solid place to start building your own thing, not his, yours. Evan looked at me, and the understanding that dawned on his face was almost painful to witness. It was the dismantling of a lifelong misconception. I never saw it that way, he whispered. I know, I said. That was my fault too. I was so busy giving you the safe, soft childhood I never had that I forgot to show you the strength that comes from weathering a few storms. We were both culpable. The realization settled over us, not as a burden, but as a strange kind of relief. It wasn't just his failure. It was ours. And if it was shared, perhaps the path forward could be shared too. He finished his tea and set the mug down with a soft click. I should go. I sep taken up enough of your time. He stood up, and I stood with him. He walked to the door, and I followed. He paused with his hand on the knob and turned back to me. Thank you for the tea, Mom. And for listening. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The spring sunlight caught him, and for a moment he looked like the young man he was supposed to be, not the broken boy or the curated groom. He turned back one last time. "The lilac," he said. "Where should I plant it for you?" The question was a revelation. He wasn't giving it to me as a gift to be placed wherever I wished. He was asking to plant it, to put it in the earth, to perform the act of building, of putting down roots, for me. I looked out at the small patch of garden beside the cottage. The soil was still cold, but the sun was warm. It was a risk. The sapling was young. A late frost could kill it, but it was a risk worth taking. "There," I said, pointing to a spot near the front window where it would get the morning sun, where I can see it from my chair. A real smile, the first one I seen from him in over a year, touched his lips. It transformed his face, lighting up his eyes, bringing back the ghost of the boy he had been. "Okay?" He walked to the spot, knelt down in the damp earth, and with his bare hands, those newly used, honest hands, he began to dig. I watched from the porch, my arms wrapped around myself, as my son planted a promise in the ground. He worked carefully, tenderly, patting the soil firmly around the base of the slender trunk. When he was finished, he stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. He looked at the little plant, then at me. There were no grand speeches, no pleas for forgiveness. There was just a simple, quiet act of hope. I still let you know how I sipped am doing," he said. "If that sip's all right, not too often, but I sipped like you to know." "I'd like that," I said, and my voice was steady. He nodded, gave the lilac sapling one last look, and then walked to his car. He didn't look back this time. He got in and drove away. I stood on the porch for a long time, looking at the freshly turned earth, at the vulnerable green leaves of the young plant. It was so small against the vastness of the sea and the sky. It would need care. It would need water. It would need to be protected from the wind and the cold. It would be years before it bloomed. But the potential was there, buried in its genes, waiting for the right conditions to unfurl. A memory made physical. A legacy, not of a house, but of a love that was learning new, tougher ways to grow. I went inside and picked up my paintbrush. I looked at the blank canvas on my easel, then I looked out the window at the newly planted lilac. For the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly what I wanted to paint. I would start with the earth, dark and rich. Then I would add the promise of green. And maybe, just maybe, I would allow myself to imagine a hint of purple, a faint, hopeful smudge of color on the far horizon, waiting for its time to come into full bloom. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning again, on a new page, in a new home, under a wide open sky. The final brushstroke was not a grand, sweeping gesture. It was a tiny dab of titanium white, a highlight on a single dewdrop-kissed leaf of the lilac sapling in my painting. I set the brush down in the jar of murky water and stepped back. On the canvas, the world outside my window was forever captured in a moment of perfect, fragile equilibrium. The sky was the soft, hazy blue of a late spring morning, meeting the slate gray of the tranquil sea at a horizon line so fine it seemed imagined. And in the foreground, dominating the composition, was the lilac bush. It was no longer a sapling. In the 3 years since Evan had planted it, it had taken hold with a stubborn, joyous vigor. Now, it was a riot of lush green foliage, and most breathtakingly, heavy, cone-shaped clusters of blossoms in the deepest, most royal purple, Clara's purple, Arthur's color. The scent that drifted through my perpetually open window was intoxicating, a fragrant ghost of my past life, but one that now sweetened my present. The painting was my best work. It was more than a rendering of light and form. It was a map of my heart. Every brushstroke held the memory of the hard years, the quiet years, the years of slow and patient growth, both the plants and our own. The sound of an engine, familiar and welcome, broke the morning stillness. I didn't rush to the window. I simply smiled, wiping my hands on a paint-streaked rag. I listened to the car door shut, not with a hesitant click, but with a solid, confident thud. I listened to his footsteps on the garden path, sure, steady, belonging. I was waiting at the open door when he reached the porch. "Evan," My son, the man he had built himself into. He was carrying a toolbox in one hand and a white bakery box in the other. His face, tanned and lined from years of outdoor work, broke into a wide, easy smile when he saw me. The ghosts of his past struggles were still there, but they were now etched into his character, not his burden. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice warm. "Brought you a bear claw, still warm." "You're a good boy," I said, taking the box and breathing in the sweet, buttery scent. The old endearment came naturally now, stripped of its former indulgence, filled with a hard-earned respect. He jerked his thumb toward the lilac bush, buzzing with bees. "That thing sip's going to take over the whole cottage soon. We might need to think about pruning it back after the bloom." "We shall see," I said, feigning indignation. "I like it just fine the way it is." He laughed. A rich, genuine sound that was the best music in the world to me. He set the toolbox down inside the door. He came over most weekends now, sometimes to fix a leaky faucet or a stubborn window sash, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk, to tell me about his work, his new circle of friends, his life. He was his own man. He'd bought a small fixer-upper house of his own a town over. He was building his own foundation, with his own 2 hands. He glanced at the easel, and his smile softened. "You finished it." "I did." He came to stand beside me, looking at the painting. He was quiet for a long time, taking it in. "You got the light just right," he said, finally, his voice thick with emotion. "The way it hits the flowers in the morning. It sits perfect, Mom." He put his arm around my shoulders, pulling me into a brief, solid hug. I leaned into him, my head resting for a moment against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar sense of sawdust, sunshine, and my son. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been stumbles, difficult conversations, and moments of doubt that stretched into weeks. The trust we had now was not the innocent, automatic trust of childhood. It was a conscious, chosen trust, woven back together thread by fragile thread. It was stronger for having been broken. He'd never asked for the house back. He'd never asked for another dime. The greatest gift I had given him was the struggle, and the greatest gift he had given me was the proof that he was equal to it. "So," he said, releasing me and clapping his hands together, heading for the toolbox, that dripping sink. "Let's see what we are dealing with." I nodded, leaving him to his work. I took my bear claw and a cup of coffee and settled into my chair by the window, the finished painting beside me. I looked from the canvas to the real world outside, at the magnificent, blooming bush, a testament to patience and second chances. I had vanished from one life. As I'd been asked to do, I had sold a house and left them with nothing. But in doing so, I hadn't just taken away. I had made space. I had left behind a void so profound that it forced a choice to collapse entirely, or to finally begin the hard, beautiful work of building something real. Evan had chosen to build, and so had I. The final chapter of our story wasn't about a confrontation or a dramatic revelation. It was about this: the quiet hum of a spring morning, the scent of coffee and lilacs, the sound of my son's voice humming under his breath as he worked under my sink. It was about the discovery that sometimes, the greatest act of love isn't holding on tight, but having the courage to let go, and the even greater courage to open the door again when a wiser, stronger version of that love comes knocking, carrying a toolbox and a warm bear claw, ready to help you build a new kind of home.